Life Management Science Labs would like to acknowledge that we live and produce this podcast on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people. We'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands of our listeners and our international colleagues. We'd like to pay our respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. Hey everyone, and welcome to All Together, the Family Science Insights podcast, produced by LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. We are champions of life management science, providing structured insights informed by science and inspired by practice on key aspects of conscious living. Each week, we bring you scientific and practical insights on each element with the expert knowledge of professionals in the field. I'm your host, Dina Sargeant. Let's get started. Hey guys, and welcome back to another episode. Now, our topic today is something that isn't really spoken about in normal conversations for various reasons. And while this topic may not have any connection to some, I hope that this topic can resonate with others and the families and friends who can also understand this. Now, according to the World Health Organization, infertility affects 1 in every 6 couples. So for our episode today, we're going to be looking into how we can support the people closest to us who are going through infertility treatment. Joining us today is Sarah Roberts, a seasoned counselor and founder of the Empty Cradle. With over 25 years of experience and a passion for understanding the human experience, Sarah brings such a unique perspective to our conversation today. Currently pursuing a Master's of Social Work focusing on involuntary, childlessness, and motherhood loss, Sarah's expertise will definitely be invaluable in navigating this challenging topic today. Thank you so much for joining us today, Sarah.
Oh, thank you so much for inviting me into this really precious conversation. Thank you.
Now, as a counselor, and also not only a counselor, but also an educator when it comes to infertility, what started your interest in talking specifically on infertility?
That's a really good question. Really personal experience. Personal experience was that I had grown up in a large family, and as a young woman, it was often about, getting educated, establishing yourself, possibly finding a partner. And I think when I was really young, it wasn't clear what I wanted to do in terms of having a family. But by my early 20s, I was very clear, late teens, early 20s, really clear that motherhood was something I really wanted in my future. And I met my partner, and we tried for 10 years. In my early 30s, I met my partner, and we had a decade of trying for children, and it didn't end up happening for us. So we went through infertility treatment. And then, by my mid-40s, transitioned into involuntary childlessness. And I'm now in my mid-50s as an older childless woman. So so it's personal experience. The second thing was that my background was in counselling and community work. And I was really surprised by when I didn't get to become a mother and other pathways to parenting weren't suitable for me. I was really surprised by the grief, and also how difficult it was that people just found it really difficult to either talk to my experience or just acknowledge and validate what I was going through. And I found it very difficult to even find counsellors who could understand and support me through that experience. So I ended up kind of redirecting my work into supporting other women who were going through infertility and moving into childlessness, and to kind of really support them through that journey as well. So that was kind of the driver for me. Yeah.
It's such an interesting thing when you sort of mentioned the grief when it comes to that as well, like the actual thought, like the hopes and dreams of it, and then it not turning out in a whole other, your life sort of took a whole other pan in a different direction. Like there's so much that we sort of don't mention about that. Like when you talk about the other ways to have kids, such as adoption and all those other aspects of it as well, you don't really, there's a whole lot of things that you don't really mention about, like, okay, not having a child is just not in someone's future at all. And no one mentions that as a, like, in my conversations with a lot of my friends, there's not a lot of conversation on it at all. There's not a lot
Yeah.
of like, what if there's some of my friends who just don't want to have children at all, and that's their choice not to have children. They just know that that's not in their future. But at the same time, there are people who are, other than that, there's either people who want kids or don't want kids. There's no like another third option of like not being able to have kids.
Yeah. Yeah. So you've touched up against something there that's really, really talks to the complexity of the experience. And so the first place maybe that you've touched on, which is really useful to acknowledge and respectful to acknowledge, is that the way that this is often thought about now is in terms of each of us has our own what they call reproductive identity. And so what that means is that it's a very individual, it's a very subjective experience in that you'll have some women and some young men who've made very clear choice that parenting is not right for them and that they don't want to be parents. And we would often talk about people who've made that decision as being child free. And look, that doesn't come without layers of complexity. But you're right, it can be quite a different experience for somebody who perhaps deeply desired parenthood and possibly expected that it might happen. And that's the case, and even possibly for people who transition to become parents. But, there's a lot of challenges involved in the parenting journey. And for some people, it can be deeply difficult experience and there can be a lot of complexity for them. But for most people, parenting often does go quite well. And so that's a really useful thing to kind of go, each individual will have their own place around their own desires, the expectations that might be placed upon them from the people around them. And then the last two pieces of it are around what choice or decision do they make, but then what is their agency? So agency is about, okay, I've made this decision. What's my capacity to make it happen? And you're right, is that often because we talk so much about choice, because choice is so much the frame we often use, we often don't have that opportunity to talk about actually, for some people, it may be that they may not have met a suitable partner in their fertile years. It might be physical health issues. It could be a whole range of other reasons as to why somebody doesn't actually have that capacity or agency to actually become parents if that's what they chose. And it's interesting, the stats that you mentioned is that it's 1 in 6 couples who can struggle to conceive and might need to access support around fertility. And it's 1 in 5 who at the end of their fertile years will not end up being a parent. So it's 20% of women, and we don't really know the split between whether it's by choice or whether it's not by choice. But a significant percentage of that 20% is not by choice. And people can be childless by infertility or they can be childless by circumstance, which means that for whatever reason they weren't able to become mothers. Yeah. So I guess the second piece that you touched on, which I think is, we may spend a little bit more time exploring, is we often live within cultures that are quite pronatal. And by that, it means that there's a lot of assumptions often that to be a grown adult woman is to become a mother. And it can be assumed that an inevitability around people becoming parents. And sometimes if that doesn't happen, it can be that it's a very personal and private and incredibly sensitive experience. And it can be difficult to know sometimes how to talk about it and engage with people around their experience. So yeah, maybe we'll talk a bit about that.
Yeah, no, I definitely would. And thank you so much for building on that acknowledgement as well of so many different avenues, so many different choices that other people are able to make. And for that introduction on your career as well, it was great to sort of get to know what really motivated you to really want to talk about this and really be here today and share a lot of what you've learned on the job. and build on that with us today.
Yeah.
Before we get deeper into it, I'd love to get to know some of your interests and maybe some of your recommendations as well that you have for us today. The first one is, do you have a favorite or maybe a most recent book that you've read?
I have some books that I grew up when I was a young woman. I was really into art, and I was really into going to art galleries, and I do a
Yeah.
lot of painting. I do a lot of gardening myself,
Oh,
and one of my heroes, or one of my heroines, really, and before I even knew that she was an involuntary childless woman, was Frida Kahlo.
oh yeah.
Um, so I've got a couple of books. One of them is a biography of Frida Kahlo, which I absolutely loved reading. And then the other book that I've got is Barbara Kingsolver, is The Lacuna, which is the story of a little bit of the story of Frida Kahlo and her life. And
Okay.
yeah, and part of her story was that she had deeply desired motherhood and had a significant accident when she was young,
Mhm.
and wasn't able to become a mother. So yeah, that was in my later years when I really resonated a lot with her story and her journey around that. So yeah, that was quite inspiring.
No,
Mm.
that's amazing to find out that there's so many other people who are sort of going through this and knowing that like there's not an alone situation where it's like, oh, you're one in 1,000 people who are going through it. That there's people who have built their whole career on something and built like a whole life for themselves without that as well,
Yeah,
without after the feeling of like not being able finding out that you're not able to have children. There's a whole other sort of relation that can sort of come up with that.
yeah. And look, it's such an interesting thing to say because I think of involuntary childlessness as being one of the really important human stories.
Mhm.
And there's a lot of, if you look in human mythology, you look across different religions, there's always been stories of people who wanted to be mothers and weren't able to be mothers. Um, and one of the things that can happen is that, particularly in kind of Western cultures, we might not be very good at sitting with and holding grief. We're often very addicted to, if you've got a problem, you've got to be able to solve it. And, it's expected that you as an individual need to be able to sort things out in your life.
Mhm.
Um, and look, infertility and childlessness can be one of those things over which there may not be an easy solution, and there might be a significant grief or impact that you might experience. And what I've found is through the healing process, it's allowed me to embrace like a different pathway to becoming an adult woman. And part of that pathway for me has been to actually open to holding when I've got difficult emotions and being able to really learn how to nurture myself through those difficult experiences. And that's that. So, for example, one of the things that can often happen when people are childless and they're really sitting with the grieving process, it can be quite difficult for us sometimes to be around parents and children. And what it does is it triggers up perhaps our own grief or our own trauma. Um, and for some people, there can be often quite a bit of shame and often isolation that can be involved, and it can be really difficult to find the support that we need.
Mhm.
Um, and one of the things that can sometimes happen is that, and it happens actually quite often, is that sometimes maybe when we do speak to our experience, it might be that the comments that sometimes come back to us can feel sometimes quite invalidating and can be quite difficult. So it's things
Mhm.
like, someone might say, "Do you have kids?" And you might say no, and they might go digging and asking why. And really what they're doing is they're actually treading on sometimes very tender ground.
Yeah.
Um, and it might be they're stepping into spaces that might be really, really painful. Um, and sometimes it might be, well, aren't you lucky? Or, you can have one of mine, parenting's so hard, or,
Mhm.
you could always adopt. And so sometimes those responses are actually quite invalidating of, what's your story and how's that been for you? And look, I think it's really important to really respect what is the relationship that I have with this other person. So, for example, if it's a quite intimate friendship or if it's a sibling, there might be more space to actually go, hey, I don't know very much about this, but as long as we stay in relationship and if you can tell me what you need and how I might be able to support you or yeah, just be able to kind of hold the space for each other. And, just being able to kind of be really honest as much as we're able to be. Yeah, it can be really important.
Yeah, no, definitely. I definitely think so. And I think sort of acknowledging your own lack of understanding as well.
Yeah.
Sort of like just sort of being there and being like, okay, I don't know a lot about it. I don't know a lot about how I can help you, but I do know that I'm going to be there for you and I'm going to be around if you ever need anyone, if you ever need even a distraction, for example. I think that's such a great thing to sort of be available for that and know that they know that you're there, which I think is just as important.
Yeah. And look, there's a couple of things I'd probably suggest in there. One of them is around that it's a very human experience and that all of us will go through things in our lives that really break our hearts. Like it might be a relationship breakup, whatever it might be. Like each of us are likely to have things in our lives where things don't go our way. And particularly around childlessness is that there's often a silence around it and it's very difficult to speak to. So sometimes staying in relationship and staying in communication with each other. And you're right, being able to kind of admit, hey, I don't know very much about this, but I really care about you. And our relationship and our friendship is really important. Also to kind of recognize that when you're going through a grieving process, and it's a really significant life transition when you go from perhaps being a potential mother, and it might have been important to you, through to you might be going through years of fertility treatment, if that's what ends up happening. And or it might be that you have years of maybe hoping for a partner to be in your life, and you might get to a point where you're starting to go, oh, maybe this isn't going to happen for me. And you're trying to kind of navigate that period of your life. To also just recognize, I guess the starting point I suggest for people can be if we can start from a place of respect, like really respecting, you're going through a tough time in your life, but I respect the essence of who you are and your capacity to learn how to navigate this and how can I support you, but perhaps also there might also even be things that maybe I learned from you and you might have a perspective to share with me that's different perhaps from my experience. And often what happens during the experience is it can be like shifting sands where you might have a period of time where it's really difficult to be around children and other times when it's much easier and you're really wanting to connect with your friends' children. So it's really one of the things that can sometimes happen is sometimes it can be a topic that's almost becomes a bit too hard. And so people might either avoid it or maybe feel like it's really hard to have a conversation around it. And what I might suggest to people might be to say, if you can start by saying, hey, this is really hard. I can see that this is what you wanted and it didn't happen. And, just acknowledge, I don't know what to say and maybe I'm going to say or do the wrong thing. And if you can let me know what you're needing, that can be a really significant part of the conversation as well. Just to stay in relationship and connection.
No, I think that's just as important. And before we go even deeper into it, do you have a favorite movie or maybe a movie that you could recommend to us?
Gosh, that's such a good question. Look, my current favourite movie, which I think was a little bit controversial, I actually really enjoyed Kate Blanchett's movie Tar, where she was the conductor. I don't know if you ever saw that movie. She was in Berlin. She was a classical conductor, and she actually ended up being there was questions around her misuse of power as a conductor, particularly towards younger women who were wanting to make their way into the classical music scene.
Okay.
Yeah, it was. I know some people found it really confronting, but I found it like a really interesting movie in terms of some of the questions that it asked.
So that sounds like a really good movie. I think I've seen a bit of it, or maybe I've seen the trailer.
You might have
to it when it came out.
Yeah,
but from that description, it makes it even more worth watching for me, honestly, because I always love the look into like okay, it's like girls supporting girls, but at the same time, it's like a whole other thing when it's older women, younger women, that kind of scenario as well, where it can really be a huge it can become a situation. It becomes something that it's no longer girls supporting girls. It's a whole other different sort of relationship where it's not always a positive one.
Yeah. And it's interesting, isn't it? Because I remember I think it was one of the early African American activists who said that sometimes when it comes to engaging with people who are different from ourselves, if we see them as either in a purely negative way or just a purely positive way, that can actually be equally as diminishing of people. And that when you're able to see that any human being can have that whole broad complexity of what it means to be human, that can be a place of really complex conversations, I guess, and the complexity of the human experience. And that, obviously there's behaviours and things that people do that are completely unacceptable and that we disagree with. But it's very human to feel anger or to feel jealousy or to feel sadness or to feel – it's very human to have often quite difficult emotions. And so how do we learn to kind of navigate and understand those emotions when they come up? And in a way, one of the way I think about my experience of involuntary childlessness, it was almost like I see it as an invitation. As I've navigated it, even though it was really hard, it was like an invitation into the fullness and the wholeness of what it means to be human. And so when I've had times where I had really difficult things to navigate, I was able to go, oh, that's a piece of me too. And there's other parts of me. And in a way, from the way I think of being an adult is actually where you're able to kind of expand into owning the wholeness of yourself. And I remember hearing this interesting thing around like the idea around responsibility is we often think of responsibility as just being about a burden, whereas when I think of shifting into being an adult, responsibility is also about the ability to respond. So it's the ability to read a situation or to understand ourselves and be able to respond to what might be going on for us as well, and to hold space for others' stories and experiences. And so that makes for a really rich engagement, doesn't it? And so that's kind of what that movie really brought to life for me, I think.
No, I think that's such a great way of looking at it as well. Like, especially when you were talking about that quote a little bit earlier, it gave me the idea of like, not everyone deserves 100% praise. There's always going to be like you can praise them. You can be like, okay, you're doing really well at this, but also there's going to be something that they're not doing well at. So if you don't see the good and the bad of a person, then you're kind of just only seeing the good. That can easily sort of put them on a pedestal that they don't really deserve to be on, in a sense.
Yeah. And it's that some people are up for that level of authenticity and some people go, well, actually, I don't really want to know. Like I don't necessarily want, the feedback, and
Exactly.
it's understanding what different relationships people are wanting to hold
Yeah.
in their lives. Yeah.
Yeah, no,
Yeah. So it's
exactly.
fascinating, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I know that everyone has a very different definition as to what family is to them. And the whole idea of what being a family would mean and what would it entail, either professionally or personally, what would your definition of a family be?
That's such a good question. Look, I think there's lots of different layers of what family can be. Like for me, there's not one really clear, this is what family is.
Yeah.
I know that in our that there can be, like, nuclear families, and that's something that can really land for someone like myself who lives in a culture. My family culture is quite one of nuclear families, where if you weren't able to have your own children, then you may not have children living in your own domestic space, and you might not have that opportunity to be as directly involved in a really, you know, in a kind of almost a daily way in the raising and nurturing of children. So there can certainly be an aspect to family that might be intergenerational. Um, I think it's also really important to think of family as being something that can also be quite self-defined, and that people can choose to make significant commitments to each other, even if it's kind of friendship-based family or community-based family. One of the things that I sometimes find with the women that I'm working with is they might be grieving the loss of that intergenerational family and the loss of the role as mother or parent. And sometimes people will say, oh, well, you could just, you could make family in other ways. And it's both and. It's like both. I need to kind of hold and process and feel that loss and process that for myself and work out a way of perhaps finding peace with the sadness and the heartbreak of that. But then there's also, but what else is possible? What else might there be in terms of commitment and extended family? And certainly there's some cultural situations, some family situations where there is a broader extended family, and there might be more opportunities to be really involved in the lives of nieces and nephews and cousins and other family members. So yeah, so that's not a definition, is it? I suppose I would say it's probably self-defined in a way. It's
Yeah,
up to people to define that for themselves.
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
I think it defines how you see it very well. There's a whole lot of different components that sort of create
Exactly
a family,
right.
whether it's your own children or your nieces and nephews or aunts and uncles. There's a whole lot of different figures that, like, I come from a family that's pretty much all around the world. We've got family in Malaysia, we've got family in New Zealand, we've got family here as well, even family that we haven't even met yet that live in Australia. And there's a whole lot of different ways that each of us communicate that are completely different. Like, I'm very close with my family from New Zealand, so I'm always talking with my nieces and nephews that are there, and always talking with my cousins that are also there. And that whole idea of family is so different because I'm not always with them. I don't know their day-to-day schedule. I don't know their day-to-day life, or catching up with them for coffee or anything like that is not something that is very well versed with me. But when I do see them, there's that, oh, we're family. We catch up so quickly. We all meet each other so easily. And
Yeah.
it's that connection of, okay, I can still enjoy the moments that you have with a family and not have to see them all the time. So that's sort of like, it's like a long distance relationship in a sense, where you're like, you're always sort of seeing them. Even the family that I have in Melbourne with me, I still hardly ever see my extended family that live here and in the same state, in the same area. But it's just, we all know that we're there. which is what I think family is. And sort of how I can understand how your definition of family is as well. It's a whole lot of different components, whole lot of different giving and taking of whether you're going to be with them one day or you're not going to be with them the next day. But it's still, you're not there to day, but when you're there, you're very much present in their life.
Yeah. And it's interesting, isn't it? Because one of the features sometimes of family can be, you're right, you may not see them in person that often, but it's kind of sometimes can be that sense of checking in at different points, almost across your life. Yeah, and you might have different levels of experience around, if I'm going through something really tough, can I turn to my family that they'll be there to offer support, or is it might be friends who step in and offer some of that more intimate support? Like it's so different, right? Every family is, has its own way of operating and expectations, and yeah, it's diverse, isn't it? It's hugely diverse.
Yeah, I think it's always a loaded question every time I ask it. I also have a show that's on parenting a little bit more, and when I ask the question of what it is to be a parent, it's a little bit easier to define, but when you're sort of talking about what is a family, what the definition of family is, it's a whole other situation. It's a whole other topic. It's a whole other thing to be talking about. And I have friends that I consider family, but I think one of the big things that you mentioned was also the expectation part to it, which is a whole other thing that I think family have more expectations on you than friends do. And people that you consider friends, that you consider family as well. And, speaking of that, I know I kind of want to know how you would define infertility in sort of a general sense, just for people who, because I know it as not being able to have children, but is there another definition that's a little bit more, is there more that it sort of encompasses the idea of infertility?
Yeah, look, there's kind of the medical definition of infertility, which is, look, what they normally look at is if somebody has been trying, if a couple's been trying, so it's infertility is usually, it assumes that somebody's actively trying to have children. So someone could be infertile, and because they're not actively trying, they might not necessarily know, but it's usually somebody who's been trying for a pregnancy, and usually if it's before 35, look, it used to be about 12 months that they would say, you probably should get that investigated. If it's somebody after 35, because of the way that physically, how basically it's how eggs and fertility can really be impacted as we age. After 35, they'll say, if you've been trying for 6 months, is to get that investigated and to look at it. And look, one of the things about, particularly for women, which is different from men, is women, it's obvious, they usually have a much clearer length of their fertility window. So, and often it's really tricky because your physical fertility, the current thinking is that you're at your peak fertility at about 24, which is super young. And so that's when your eggs are at the best, you're going to have, it's kind of the fitness, you're going to be able to carry a baby. Like usually that's considered the point at which it's the peak. But in terms of when you're emotionally ready, when you're socially ready, if you want to, you may or may not want to do it with a partner, you might want to be in a particular place in terms of work and education. There's a lot of moving parts often. And so that they're all things that can really impact on women's experience during their fertile years. So that's my understanding of how fertility is defined, is that you've tried for children and you've not been able to conceive naturally.
So one of the misconceptions that sort of come about quite often is it's kind of like the blame game. It was like, it's usually they say, oh, it's the woman's fault. the fact that she can't have a child or bear a child or anything like that. What do you think about that misconception that sort of takes place? Because I know in especially biology, you know, it's both sides. Both sides really take part in that. It's not just the woman's side. It could be the male side as well. Why do you think that it's typically put on the woman and typically put on the fact that she's not able to have kids?
So there's a couple of things in there that you've kind of touched on which are really significant.
Okay.
One of them is that reproduction, fertility, infertility, it can be a very gendered experience. There can be quite gendered expectations and norms. So in some contexts, being able to have children and, you know, siring children and carrying on the family name can be very much a part of what it means to be a man and masculinity.
Yeah.
And it can be similar for women, where it's very similar around that it's not unusual for people to equate womanhood and motherhood, and the assumption that for you to be an adult woman is for you to bear children and to be a mother. And often what happens is that not everybody, but quite a few people, when they're experiencing infertility, can also experience sometimes a sense of shame and a sense of unworthiness, and it can really impact on their sense of self and being in their body and their relationship with their body, in that I thought I would be able to have children and it hasn't happened for me. So that can be really super confronting. And we do live in a culture of which there's a couple of, without getting too technical, but there's a couple of underlying kind of, I guess, ideologies that really drive that. And one of them is what we call pronatalism. And pronatalism is the assumption that every adult becomes a parent, and that we often give a lot more space and sometimes more value to the experience of parenting. And often people who aren't able to be parents or who don't have children, they can often be quite silenced, and it's not okay necessarily for them to talk about their experience and their story. And so there can be a sense sometimes people can experience feeling devalued. And look, the equivalent of that would be if you look at something like being from LGBT background. So if you, and so what we have that drives that is what we call heterosexism, which is the assumption that everybody is straight and that somebody who isn't straight is considered other or considered different from the norm. So it's similar for people who don't have children, is that it's assumed that everybody's a parent, and that if you don't have parents, that you're kind of other or you're different, or we don't know that much about your life. And so what often happens for us is that the way that we might be portrayed in films or the way that we might be spoken to, there can be a lot of stereotypes and assumptions about us and our lives. And so part of what quite a few of us are trying to do who don't have children is to kind of raise awareness and do research and ask some questions and I guess make more awareness of what our experiences are, and that we've always been around and that we're a really important part of what it means to be human and part of the human story, I guess. So yeah, that's one of the things I think that childless people bring forward in our experiences. So
it's really fascinating, because I did want to sort of ask, and feel free to say that this is not something that you want to talk about, but when it comes to the experience that you've had of, okay, there's like a lot of groups and people of going through infertility treatment, and there's like, you talk to each other quite often, and just that emotion of, okay, one person who's gone through an infertility treatment and it's worked out for them, and they end up falling pregnant and having a child, and it doesn't work out for the other person. How does that relationship sort of go? Because at one time you feel happy for them, but at the same time there's that, oh, why can't that be me kind of feeling as well. How do you go ahead and support both sides in a way that both sides feel comfortable and both sides are respectful of each other?
Yeah, look, that's such a good question, because really one of the things that can happen, which is kind of almost when someone transitions into being a parent, it can be a massive life transition. It's all of a sudden there's this little being that is incredibly demanding, and it requires, it's a huge lifestyle change, a huge new set of skills that person might need to learn. And they're often going to turn, and they do this thing when people transition into parenthood. It's called social pruning. And so often what happens is that they might actually really shift their social relationships and social networks. And so what can happen is that person might turn towards other parents to actually learn how to be a parent. What can also happen is that as children grow, they actually start to develop their own social relationships. And so often what can happen is that, for example, parents might choose to, say, socialize with other parents so that their kids can play together. And it becomes almost like sometimes what can happen is that people who aren't parenting can often be the ones who might get deprioritized or might be moved, not necessarily intentionally, but sometimes it can be really hard to maintain those relationships. The other thing that can happen for the person who's childless is that they're also going potentially through a really significant life transition. So the research around someone who's going through fertility treatment around their psychological health, it can be as stressful to go through cancer treatment as it can be to go through fertility treatment. And so it can be like this real roller coaster of hope, hope, hope. And then, the losses as they continue to, they might have one cycle after another, and they're going through their own grief experience. And all of a sudden, this really precious friend or sibling or somebody in their life, is living the dream and the hope that they wanted. And it can actually really churn up some really difficult emotions for them around that friendship. And so it's almost like those two life experiences become almost like repelling magnets. And so when you take somebody who might have been hopeful of parenthood, it didn't happen, and they're transitioning then into being an older childless person, and that can involve like, I don't know what this is going to look like. I don't know what family's going to look like for me now. There could be a whole lot of fears, like what's going to happen for me as I age. A lot of questions that come up around life and meaning and legacy and purpose. And there's a lot of things that person might need to be trying to work out for themselves. And so it can make that ground that we connect on in friendships quite difficult. And one of the things I guess I suggest just to gently think about, which we touched on earlier, is sometimes if there can be an honest conversation around this, to go, hey, this is really hard. Like, I don't know how we're going to get through this, but if we can manage to maybe stay connected and have some conversations and focus on the things that are really important. So, I really care about you, and this friendship's really important to me, and how might we be able to stay connected? And look, it's things like, if you're going to be doing, there's some quite practical things, like if there's going to be something like a pregnancy announcement, so perhaps if you know someone who's struggling with infertility, is maybe to give them a heads up, so that rather than doing it in a big group situation in front of a whole lot of other people, it might be that you might connect with them and just say, look, I just wanted to let you know, just so that you're prepared emotionally and you can privately process if it brings up difficult feelings. And then, you can choose how much you want to participate or be involved. So some childless people might do things like, they might say, look, it's really difficult for me to perhaps go to a baby shower, but I'd love to catch up with you for coffee and maybe give you a gift separately. And so what I would suggest, which is often sometimes what happens, is people find it too difficult, so they kind of shut people out of their lives, or they avoid that person, or just don't invite them to things. Whereas that can be just as painful as being really triggered. Like, to be shut out can be really quite heartbreaking. And so I guess I just suggest, if you can find a way to stay in dialogue and stay in relationship, and even to acknowledge, hey, let's find a way through this. I don't know how we're going to do that, but let's try and find a way. And to kind of recognize that childless people as well will learn how to hold and navigate their own experience and their own story. And there are people around to support them through that. So it might be to support them through the really difficult times. The other thing that can be really helpful can be for people to reach out to each other. Like you said, is when people are going through infertility, to have others who are going through infertility. And then, if that person's later transitioning to childlessness, might be to reach out and connect with, whether there's some online communities, there's some specialist counsellors, there's more and more opportunities for people to seek out support and healing around their childlessness. So,
Okay.
yeah. So to bring that into the frame as well is helpful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we're talking a lot about different terminologies. I think we spoke about this quite a lot before we started recording as well. But when it comes to question do's and don'ts, questions that you can ask, questions that you can't ask, what are some questions? Like, if, for example, there's someone who's going through the infertility treatment, who's sort of going closer to childlessness, what kind of things do you not mention? I know one of the big ones is, so why don't you have kids, for example? Like, I know people, even if they aren't going through childlessness, and if you don't know them as well, one of the things that I hate the most is I was always hearing, when are you going to have kids? Why don't you have kids? And it's not just me who's like, I'm 26 having those questions already being asked. I can only imagine how people who are going through the infertility, how they would feel about, and how annoying it would feel for them to always have that response on hand. So how do we sort of stop getting people to answer those questions, or getting people to ask those questions? Or, like, is there things that we can make sure for us to be aware of, and to just be appreciative about other people sort of asking those questions, or not, and making sure they don't ask those questions?
Yeah. Look, that's the beginning of a really big conversation, right?
Yeah.
And one of the really valuable things is hosting a conversation like this, like the fact that you're hosting a conversation that's a public conversation, and it allows space for people to listen and think about and hear what it might be like, and the complexity perhaps of people's stories. Look, I think the first starting point is probably around anyone's experience, is to kind of just be aware of, hey, what is it when I'm having a conversation with somebody where perhaps I'm starting a conversation making assumptions. So, for example, and it's interesting because there's also some stuff there around having some grace and being, also understanding that when it comes to kind of social, general chit-chat conversations, there can be topics that are kind of the go-to topics. So things like work.
Yeah.
So, for example, if you really focus on, what work do you do? If you've got somebody who's unemployed, that could be quite a touchy topic, right?
Yeah.
Or if it's, do you have kids? And the person, you need to be prepared to say, if I ask that question, there's going to be some people who might have a really complex answer to that, and possibly quite a tender answer to that. And it might not necessarily be that you don't ask the question. It might be, am I prepared to, if, for example, someone says no, do I have a follow-up respectful response. So if someone says no and your first question is why,
Yeah.
you know, my honest answer to that is quite a long and involved story that involves a lot of losses. It involves 10 years of fertility treatment. And I kind of sit there and I go, I talk about this publicly. So I'm often able to hold the space for the truth of that when I talk publicly to people.
Yeah.
But I don't really talk about that in private social situations. Like if I'm meeting somebody, if I met somebody out generally socially chatting, like I'm not going to go into the detail necessarily about what my fertility story is. And it's partly because it's actually often going to make the other person feel incredibly uncomfortable because it might bring up really difficult emotions in them. And it's that thing where, and it's similar, for example, if you had somebody who had been a parent and had a child who had died, who'd passed away, to be prepared that if I maybe ask that question, that there might be some really tender answers to that, and how am I going to respond after that? So it might not be, if somebody, for example, says they're going through fertility treatment, quite a lot of the answers we get that can be really hard, can be things like, oh, don't give up, or the miracle baby story where, my second cousin, I don't know, went and ate 50, I don't know, had a turmeric-only diet and got pregnant. People come up with, they often will tell you things that are the miracle pregnancy stories, which actually can sometimes be quite disheartening and also quite invalidating, where you're kind of going, hey, I've been doing this for a decade. The other one that's really common is people go, have you thought of adoption? And you kind of sit there and you go, hadn't occurred to me. Do you know what I mean? And so what's happening there is, what someone's often doing is they're saying, I can see this is really important to you, so I'm going to jump into problem solving it with you.
Yeah.
Whereas sometimes it can actually be about, how is that for you? And particularly if it's a close friend, it's like, oh, I've just asked you what might be quite a tender question, like what response would be helpful for you? Even to be transparent around that, or even to say, would you like to change the subject? Is there something else, what interests or hobbies do you have? Or if you can build your skills in a conversational way, that if it's not appropriate to talk in any more detail, and that person may not want to talk in any more detail, is to actually be able to have some skills around moving the conversation on. And look, being able to converse and have conversations really is an art form, and it's often not something that we actually take the time to learn. How do we learn to do that well? And so there's some real value in, it's a really significant life skill. And it's a similar thing in Australia, where you'll hear people from different cultural backgrounds get so sick of asking, where are you from? Okay. From Melbourne.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
Only a response.
Yeah. And the weird thing is that as a woman with white skin, no one ever asks me, where are you from? No one actually ever says, and I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but it is actually,
it's also very separating,
a racialized thing. Yeah. But also at the same time, it is interesting, and you hear about, for example, Aboriginal people, and they'll talk about that's how greeting is done. If you've not met an Aboriginal person, when you meet them for the first time, when Aboriginal people meet each other, there will be a lot of, who's your family, who's your mob, where are you from, what's your country? There is that real sense of connection. And so it's how do you have those conversations in a really caring, respectful way? And it's partly about intention, right? And really, one of the other things that can happen in terms of responses is that people can, you might say, I don't have kids, and you might have a parent who's actually really under pressure and quite stressed, and they'll go, oh, aren't you lucky? Or you get to lie in, or, they might glamorize your life. And sometimes they'll think of, for example, me now, I'm in my mid-50s, and I'm a really different woman from who I was in my mid-20s. And sometimes they'll think, oh, I was unpartnered, or I didn't have kids when I was 25. And they'll think of your life as being like that you were 25, and you're going, no, hang on, I'm a mature woman. I don't actually go out to nightclubs every night. And do you know what I mean? Like, I'm not living the life of a 25-year-old.
Yeah.
I actually matured and became, a middle-aged adult woman. And do you know what I mean? And so it's partly also about how do we hold curiosity about each other's lives, where not intrusively, but, do we have times where we go, oh, I wonder what that person's life is like? Like, my life is so full of children. Like, I wonder how that person spends their time and how they make meaning and what's important to them. So it's creating space for those kinds of dialogues, right? Yeah.
And I think it's really important to sort of ask that as well. Like, I think there needs to be some level of comfort on both sides to be asking and answering that. There needs to be comfort on the person who's asking the questions and the person who's answering them. There needs to be some level of understanding, saying there's no judgment on either side. There's no, I'm saying, oh, you should have kids at this time. And I feel like when you meet someone the first time and that's the question that they ask, it says a lot about their personality as well to me. Like, if that's the first thing that they're looking at, and that's the first thing that they're sort of acknowledging of you, is the fact that you don't have that, or that's something that you don't have, then that says a lot about their character. And that's not something that you would like to participate in usually, because that's, for me, that says, okay, they're focusing so much on what they have that you don't, rather than looking and acknowledging the fact. And I've had a lot of conversations with friends about that, of different age groups and of different sort of backgrounds, as well as sort of like what having a child would mean to them.
Yeah.
And we have deep discussions on the fact that it would affect their family. It would affect so many different aspects of their relationship with their parents, because they'd be like, oh, my parents would become grandparents. And that means that they would always be around with grandparents. They would always have people there. But then when you have people who are not in that or don't have that opportunity, there's a whole other conversation of, okay, how can I sort of still manage to talk about this area, talk about having kids, talk about all that, but in a place that's not going to be insensitive and acknowledging, because it's very different when you're talking to a stranger about it and when you're talking to close friends about it. It's not something that you really want to, and I think you mentioned that as well. It's not something that you want to tell a complete stranger about the whole life story about, that you could probably write a book on the experience. And I think it's great that we came here today to really acknowledge the fact that there's a whole lot of insensitivities that sort of can come across. It's not aiming at being insensitive. Sometimes people are genuinely curious, but they don't know how to get out of that awkward stage of the minute they ask why and they immediately regret it. I think I've had that experience once in myself, where that's a conversation that I've had with, I was very young at that time, so I sort of was very naive to the fact that infertility was something that actually happens. And when I had that question, I was like, oh, wait, but why not? That was my thing. And I remember my mom sort of really being like, you can't ask that. You can't ask why aren't they having kids. You don't know what they could be going through. And it was at that point that I realized that that was a question that you shouldn't ask, that you shouldn't really sort of say, but why not?
And it's really, like, the way that I tend to think about this is I don't know that because it's so subjective. And you might have one childless person who says, it's completely private, it's super sensitive, I never want to talk about this. And then you might have another childless person who said, no one ever asked me, and it's so nice that actually people care and want to know and actually are open to me, like are willing to create a space for me to talk about it. And often, I guess what I'm saying is that it's not like there's completely hard and fast rules, but sometimes you can have a conversation that isn't just about the content of the conversation, but it actually can be about almost lifting it into, hey, I've never met anybody who doesn't have children. Is this something that you feel comfortable talking about? Do you know what I mean? So it's like you haven't just launched into asking them.
Yeah.
You've kind of almost asked permission, if you know what I mean. And it might be that you don't do that in a group, but it might be, you might, for example, you might have a young woman, for example, who has an aunt that didn't have kids. And it might be, for example, that young woman's thinking through options for her life. And she might privately and intimately approach her auntie and say, look, do you feel comfortable if I have a chat with you about this? And, if you feel comfortable sharing your perspective and your story, and maybe is there some wisdom that I could learn because it's outside of my experience, and that then gives the permission to that person to say, look, I do or don't feel comfortable talking about it. But I guess what I'm saying is that it's absolutely about sensitivity, but it's also about a skillfulness. It's a skillfulness around how do I learn to engage and ask questions in a way that are respectful. Yeah, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like it might be. So, for example, if someone's going through fertility treatment, it might be, there were times when I was going through fertility treatment where I was really in the problem-solving phase and I was open to suggestions and tips and what I could have done differently. But as the years went on and it became more and more likely that it wasn't going to happen, it kind of started to feel like I was getting really jaded, and it was like, don't give up. And it was almost like it felt like a pressure to just keep going at whatever cost. And what was happening was that it was really impacting on my psychological health, and it became a really difficult period in my life.
Yeah.
So it became more difficult to talk about at that point.
Okay.
Yeah. So, and I guess that's what I mean is when I say it's shifting sands, it's really about if we can stay in relationship with each other, and it may shift, and what are people's needs at different points. And, within a friendship, and this is kind of this is something that is a little frame that I often use when I'm talking with women about friendship is when you do relationship therapy, so when you learn how to do relationship therapy, there's the first partner, there's the second partner, and then they talk about the relationship as almost being this third piece, or this third part of, it's like the space between us. It's neither you nor me, it's actually the relationship itself.
Yeah.
And so sometimes it can be helpful to think about that in terms of friendship, where there's the first friend and the second friend, and each of you is going to have different needs over time. And it might be that you think about the friendship as being like a third piece, and you go, hey, what does the friendship need at this point? And it might be, there might be a period of time where I'm not able to be there for you during this period of your life, but maybe we can reconnect and talk about that and work out how to process that through. And, it might be that our friendship needs us to have some joyful experiences together and go and do some fun stuff, or perhaps regularly catch up, or even kind of just, have a regular time when we connect with each other in each other's lives. So, the thing with friendships is some friendships will be really enduring and lifelong, and others will be for certain periods of time in our life, and being able to kind of flow with that a little bit as well, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah. No, I think that's the really big point I think you make as well, where it's friendships are always going to come and go.
Yeah.
And sometimes you just got to let it come and go.
Yes.
You can't really like force someone to be around if it's no longer serving.
Exactly.
And
And also giving yourself permission that it's okay to actually grieve friendships. Like I remember it took me quite a long time until I remember one friendship that sadly ended about a decade ago for me. And I remember one of the things I do is I live in the west of Brisbane, and I live on some acreage land, and we're in koala habitat and do a lot of native re-veg planting. So I put up a lot of, eucalypts and that sort of thing for them. And I remember one day I was just feeling so sad I knew this friendship was coming to a close, and I knew that we weren't going to continue contact with each other. And it had been someone that had been really special to me. And I remember going to the bottom of the garden and actually having a little cry about it, and kind of giving myself permission to feel sad and to grieve, that when people do leave our lives, that it's actually okay to feel some sadness and to let that person go. To just kind of allow ourselves some movement and some grace with those changes in our lives. Hey,
yeah,
it can be really
important.
important.
And I think that's such a great way of the show to end the show today, is sort of just understanding the fact that situations happen, people can come and go, dreams can sort of come and go as well, and be filled up with other dreams and be filled up with other plans, that you sort of make the best out of a situation. And the resilience in ourselves as well is such a big part of today's topic. And what we're talking about today is resilience in ourselves and resilience in others, I think, is so important. Thank you so much for coming onto the show and for
so welcome
talking about this, and from hearing it from your perspective as well, not just professionally, but also the personal lived experience, I think adds some kind of extra information that we sort of didn't get to hear. Because when we talk about it, you hear a lot of the scientific sides, you hear a lot of the what a lot of people study years to be able to talk about, but you never really hear the emotion side to it. So thank you so much, Sarah, for sort of opening up a lot about your journey and a lot of how you've used what your experience was and built a whole avenue for a lot of people who are going through the same situation and have that support. So thank you so much, Sarah, for joining me on the show.
Thank you. And if people wanted to find out more about childlessness, I would you're welcome to reach out to the Empty Cradle, which is where the service I've established for women. But there's also some other wonderful lived experience practitioners. And then there's also World Childless Week, which happens in September. And there's a wonderful event that happens every year online. It's for a week where there's lots of writings and stories and videos and a lot of poetry and just a lot of perspectives from people who, both women and men, who'd wanted to be parents and it didn't happen. So if you've got somebody in your life who's going through the experience, it allows you to see both the difficulty and the grief and the challenges of the story, but also the possibility. I have to tell you that I almost get a bit teary when I tell you this. Some of the people I have met who wanted to be parents and didn't become parents are just some of the most extraordinary people, in that even though they're living quite ordinary lives, and I don't mean in the sense of they have to go out and do these incredible things because they didn't become parents. It's actually what happens when we go through childlessness is it makes us really in touch with our feelings, very compassionate, very caring. And in a way, it can often soften us and make us just really loving people in the community. And so, and I don't want to kind of overplay that too much, but yeah, just such a lot of respect for people who where life doesn't go our way, and how we navigate that experience, and what is it that helps us to get through that, but then also as we come out of that, how that might have changed us in various ways. So so thank you for hosting this conversation. So really appreciate it.
I'm glad to open up an avenue, and I hope that it definitely leads a whole lot more people over to your site as well, to be able to share their experiences or to hear other people's experiences and hear the fact that it's not a be all and end all, that there's so much more to it. And there's also that emotion side to it where they're able to understand the grief behind it, understand a whole lot of reasons why they feel the way that they do.
Yeah.
So thank you so much, Sarah, for joining me on the show. And I'll definitely have a link down to the Empty Cradle as well, for everyone who wants to access it, for anyone who's wanting to even know more about it and know more information about infertility. So I hope you guys learned as much as I did. I'll see you all in the next episode.
Thank you.
You've been listening to All Together, the Family Science Insights podcast, produced by the Family Science Labs, a division of LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. More episodes are available from 10 life management perspectives and can be found by searching LMSL on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and other podcasting apps available on your devices. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider rating our show, sharing it, and subscribing to our channel, as it helps other people find it so that we can grow and bring you more quality resources. More of our work can be found on our website at fa.lmsl.net, where you can join our movement. I'm Dina Sargeant. Thanks for tuning in.